Hi everyone, this is Mrs. J. I'm doing a read aloud of Out of the Dust by Karen Hess, and we're on summer 1934, and we're starting on page 55. Hope in a Drizzle. Quarter-inch of rain is nothing to complain about. It'll help the plants above ground and start the new seeds growing. That quarter-inch of rain did wonders for Ma, too, who is ripe as a melon these days. She has nothing to say to anyone anymore, except how she aches for rain. At breakfast, at dinner, all day, all night, she aches for rain. Today she stood out in the drizzle, hidden from the road, and from Daddy, and she thought from me. But I could see her from the barn. She was bare as a pear, raindrops sliding down her skin, leaving traces of mud on her face and along her back, trickling dark and light paths, slow tracks of wet dust down the bulge of her belly. My dazzling Ma, round and ripe and striped like a melon. July 1934. Dionne Quintuplets. When the dust blew down our road, against our house, across our fields, up in Canada, a lady named Elzire Dionne gave birth to 5 baby girls all at once. I looked at Ma, so pregnant with one baby. "Can you imagine 5?" I said. Ma lowered herself into a chair, tears dropping on her tight-stretched belly. She wept just to think of it. July 1934. Wild boy of the road. A boy came by the house today. He asked for food. He couldn't pay anything, but Ma sat him down and gave him biscuits and milk. He offered to work for his meal. Ma sent him out to see Daddy. The boy and Daddy came back late in the afternoon. The boy walked 2 steps behind, in Daddy's dust. He wasn't more than 16, thin as a fence rail. I wondered what Livy Killian's brother looked like now. I wondered about Livy herself. Daddy asked if the boy wanted a bath, a haircut, a change of clothes before he moved on. The boy nodded. I never heard him say more than "yes, sir," or "no, sir," or "much obliged." We watched him walk away down the road in a pair of Daddy's mended overalls, his legs like willow limbs, his arms like reeds. Ma rested her hands on her heavy stomach. Daddy rested his chin on the top of my head. "His mother is worrying about him," Ma said. "His mother is wishing her boy would come home." Lots of mothers wishing that these days, while their sons walk to California when the rain comes, and the color green doesn't seem like such a miracle, and hope rises daily, like sap in a stem. And I think, someday I'm going to walk there too. Through New Mexico and Arizona and Nevada, someday I'll leave behind the wind and the dust and walk my way west and make myself to a home in that distant place of green vines and promise. July 1934. The accident. I got burned bad. Daddy put a pail of kerosene next to the stove, and Ma, fixin' breakfast, thinking the pail was filled with water, lifted it to make Daddy's coffee, poured it, but instead of making coffee, Ma made a rope of fire. It rose up from the stove to the pail, and the kerosene burst into flames. Ma ran across the kitchen, out of the porch door, screaming for Daddy. I tore after her. Then, thinking of the burning pail left behind in the bone-dry kitchen, I flew back and grabbed it, throwing it out the door. I didn't know. I didn't know Ma was coming back. The flaming oil splashed onto her apron, and suddenly Ma was a column of fire. I pushed her down to the ground, desperate to save her, desperate to save the baby. I tried, beating out the flames with my hands. I did the best I could, but it was no good. Ma got burned bad. July 1934. Burns. At first I felt no pain, only heat. I thought I might be swallowed by the heat, like the witch in Hansel and Gretel, and nothing would be left of me. Someone brought Doc Rice. He tended Ma first, then came to me. The doctor cut away the skin on my hands. It hung in crusted strips. He cut my skin away with scissors, and then poked my hands with pins to see what I could feel. He bathed my burns in antiseptic. Only then the pain came. July 1934. Nightmare. I am awake now, still shaking from my dream. I was coming home through a howling dust storm. My lowered face was scrubbed raw by dirt and wind. Grit scratched my eyes. It crunched between my teeth. Sand chafed inside my clothes, against my skin. Just crept inside my ears, up my nose, down my throat. I shuddered, nasty with dust. In the house, dust blew through the cracks in the walls. It covered the floorboards and heaped against the doors. It floated in the air, everywhere. I didn't care about anyone, anything, only the piano. I searched for it. Found it under a mound of dust. I was angry at Ma for letting in the dust. I cleaned off the keys, but when I played, a tortured sound came from the piano, like someone shrieking. I hit the keys with my fist, and the piano broke into 100 pieces. Daddy called me. He asked me to bring water. Ma was thirsty. I brought up a pail of fire, and Ma drank it. She had given birth to a baby of flames. The baby burned at her side. I ran away, to the Easton's farm. The house had been tractored out, tipped off of its foundation. No one could live there. Everywhere I looked were dunes of rippled dust. The wind roared like fire. The door to the house hung open, and there was dust inside, several feet deep. And there was a piano. The bench was gone, right through the floor. The piano leaned toward me. I stood and played. The relief I felt to hear the sound of music after the sound of the piano at home. I dragged the Easton's piano through the dust to our house. But when I got there, I couldn't play. I had swollen lumps for hands. They dripped a sickly pus. They swung stupidly from my wrists. They stung with pain. When I woke up, the part about my hands was real. July 1934. A tent of pain. Daddy has made a tent out of a sheet over Ma so nothing will touch her skin, what skin she has left. I can't look at her. I can't recognize her. She smells like scorched meat. Her body groaning there, it looks nothing like my Ma. It doesn't even have a face. Daddy brings her water and drips it inside of the slit of her mouth by squeezing a cloth. She can't open her eyes. She cries out when the baby moves inside her. Otherwise she moans, day and night. I wish the dust would plug my ears so I couldn't hear her. July 1934. Drinking. Daddy found the money Ma kept squirreled away in the kitchen under the threshold. It wasn't very much, but it was enough for him to get good and drunk. He went out last night. While Ma moaned and begged for water, he drank up the emergency money until it was gone. I tried to help her. I couldn't aim the dripping cloth into her mouth. I couldn't squeeze. It hurt the blisters on my hands to try. I only made it worse for Ma. She cried for the pain of the water running into her sores. She cried for the water that would not soothe her throat and quench her thirst. And the whole time my father was in Gaiman drinking. July 1934. Devoured. Doc sent me outside to get water. The day was so hot. The house was so hot. As I came out the door, I saw the cloud descending. It whirred like 1,000 engines. It shifted shape as it came, seething, settling first over Daddy's wheat. Grasshoppers, eating tassels, leaves, stalks, then coming closer to the house, eating Ma's garden, the fence posts, the laundry on the line, and then the grasshoppers came right over me, descending on Ma's apple trees. I climbed into the trees, opening the scabs on my tender hands, grasshoppers clinging to me. I tried to beat them away, but the grasshoppers ate every leaf. They ate every piece of fruit. Nothing left but a couple of apple cores, hanging from Ma's trees. I couldn't tell her, couldn't bring myself to say her apples were gone. I never had a chance. Ma died that day, giving birth to my brother. August 1934. Blame. My father's sister came to fetch my brother, even as Ma's body cooled. She came to bring my brother back to Lubbock to raise as her own. But my brother died before Aunt Ellis got here. She wouldn't even hold his little body. She barely noticed me. As soon as she found my brother dead, she had a talk with my father. Then she turned around and headed back to Lubbock. The neighbor women came. They wrapped my baby brother in a blanket and placed him in Ma's bandaged arms. We buried them together on the rise Ma loved, the one she'd gazed at the front from the kitchen window, the one that looks out over the dried-up Beaver River. Reverend Bingham led the service. He talked about Ma, but what he said made no sense, and I could tell he didn't truly know her. He'd never even heard her play piano. He asked my father to name my baby brother. My father, hunched over, said nothing. I spoke up in my father's silence. I told the Reverend my brother's name was Franklin, like our president. The woman talked as they scrubbed death from the house. I stayed in my room, silent on the iron bed, listening to their voices. Billy Joe threw the pail, they said. An accident, they said, under their words a pointed finger. They didn't talk about my father leaving kerosene by the stove. They didn't say a word about my father drinking himself into a stupor while Ma writhed begging for water. They only said, Billy Joe threw the pail of kerosene. August 1934. Birthday. I walk to town. I don't look back over my shoulder at the single grave holding Ma and my little brother. I'm trying not to look back at anything. Dust rises with each step. There's a greasy smell to the air. On either side of the road are the carcasses of jackrabbits, small birds, field mice, stretching out in the distance. My father stares out across his land, empty but for a few withered stalks, like the tufts on an old man's head. I don't know if he thinks more of Ma or the wheat that used to grow here. There is barely a blade of grass swaying in the stinging wind. There are only these lumps of flesh that once were hands long enough to span octaves, swinging at my sides. I come up quiet and sit behind Arlie Wanderdale's house, where no one can see me, and lean my head back, and close my eyes, and listen to Arlie play. August 1934. Roots. President Roosevelt tells us to plant trees. Trees will break the wind, he says. Trees will end the drought. The animals can take shelter there. Children can take shelter. Trees have roots, he says. They hold on to the land. That's good advice, but I'm not sure he understands the problem. Trees have never been at home here. They're just not meant to be here. Maybe none of us are meant to be here. Only the prairie grass and the hawks. My father will stay, no matter what. He's stubborn as sod. He and the land have to hold on to each other. But what about me? August 1934. The empty spaces. I don't know my father anymore. He sits across from me. He looks like my father. He chews his food like my father. He brushes his dusty hair back like my father. But he is a stranger. I'm awkward with him and irritated. And I want to be alone, but I'm terrified of being alone. We are both changing. We are shifting to fill the empty spaces left by Ma. I keep my raw and stinging hands behind my back when he comes near because he stares when he sees them. September 1934. The hole. The heat from the cook stove hurts my burns, and the salt, the water, and the dust hurts too. I spend all my time in pain, and my father spends his time outside of the house digging a hole, 40 feet by 60 feet, 6 feet deep. I think he's digging the pond to feed off of the windmill, the one Ma wanted, but he doesn't say, he just digs. He sends me to the train yard to gather boards that were once boxcars, but are now junk. I bring them back, careful of the scabs and the raw sores on my bare hands. I don't know what he needs boards for. He doesn't tell me. When he's not in the hole, digging, he's working on the windmill, replacing the parts that kept it from turning. People stop by and watch. They think my father is crazy digging such a big hole. I think he's crazy too. The water will seep back into the earth. It'll never stay put in any old pond. But my father has thought through all that and he's digging anyway. I think to talk to Ma about it, and then I remember. I can almost forgive him for taking Ma's money. I can almost forgive him his night in Guyman getting drunk. But as long as I live, no matter how big a hole he digs, I can't forgive him for that pail of kerosene left by the side of the stove. September 1934. Kilauea. A volcano erupted in Hawaii, Kilauea. It threw huge chunks into the air. The ground shook, and smoke choked everything in its path. Sounds a little like a dust storm. September 1934. Boxes. In my closet are 2 boxes, the gatherings of my life. Papers, school drawings, a broken hairpin, a dress from my baby days, my first lock of hair, a tiny basket woven from prairie grass, a doll with a china head, a pink ball, 3 dozen marbles, a fan from Baxter's funeral home, my baby teeth in a glass jar, a torn map of the world, 2 candy wrappers, 1,000 things I haven't looked at in years. I kept promising to go through the boxes with Ma and get rid of what I didn't need. But I never got to it, and now my hands hurt, and I haven't got the heart. September 1934. Night bloomer. Mrs. Brown's cereus plant bloomed on Saturday night. She sent word after promising I could come see it. I've rubbed my gritty eyes with swollen hands. My stomach grizzled as I made my way through the dark to her house. Ma wouldn't have let me go at all. My father just stood there in the doorway and watched me leave. It was almost 3 in the morning when I got there. A small crowd stood around. Mrs. Brown said the blossom opened at midnight, big as a dinner plate. It took only moments to unfold. How can such a flower find a way to bloom in this drought, in this wind? It blossomed at night, when the sun couldn't scorch it, when the wind was quiet, where there might have been a sip of dew to freshen it. I couldn't watch at dawn, when the flower, touched by the first finger of morning light, withered and died. I couldn't watch as tender petals burned up in the sun. September 1934. The path of our sorrow. Miss Freeland said, during the Great War we fed the world. We couldn't grow enough wheat to fill all the bellies. The price the world paid for our wheat was so high it swelled our wallets and our heads, and we bought bigger tractors, more acres, until we had mortgages and rent and bills beyond reason. But we all felt it so useful we didn't notice. Then the war ended, and before long, Europe didn't need our wheat anymore. They can grow their own. But we needed Europe's money to pay our mortgage, our rent, our bills. We squeezed more cattle, more sheep, onto less land, and they grazed down to the stubble until they reached rue. The price of wheat kept dropping, so we had to grow more bushels to make the same amount of money we made before, to pay for all the equipment, all the land. And all the more sod we plowed up, the drier things got, because the water that used to collect there under the grass, biding its time, keeping things alive through the dry spells, wasn't there anymore. Without the sod, the water vanished. The soil turned to dust, until the wind took it up, lifting it up and carrying it away. Such a sorrow doesn't come suddenly. There are thousands of steps to take before you get there. But now, sorrow climbs onto our front steps, big as Texas, and we didn't even see it coming, even though it had been making its way straight for us all along. September 1934.